The Andersonville National Historic Site, located near Andersonville, Georgia, preserves the former Andersonville Prison, also known as Camp Sumter. It's a Confederate prison of war camp. During the final 14 months of the American Civil War, most of the site lies in the southwestern Macon County, adjacent to the east side of the town of Andersonville. The site also contains the Andersonville National Cemetery and the National Prisoner of War Museum. The prison was created in 1864, served until April 1865. The site was commanded by Captain Henry Wirtz, who was tried and executed after the war for war crimes. The prison was overcrowded to 4 times the capacity and had inadequate water supply, inadequate food, and unsanitary condition. Of the approximately 45,000 Union prisoners held at Camp Sumter during the war, nearly 13,000 died. Chief causes of death were scurvy, diarrhea, and dysentery. The prison, which opened in February 1864, originally covered about 16.5 acres. It was enclosed by a 15-foot high stockade. In June 1864, it was enlarged to 26 acres, and the stockade was rectangular in dimension, 1,620 feet by 779 feet. There were 2 entrances on the west side of the stockade, known as the north entrance and the south entrance. This allows for space for about 5 feet by 6 feet for each prisoner. At Andersonville, a light fence known as the deadline was erected about 19 feet inside the stockade wall. It demarcated the no man's land that kept prisoners away from the wall, which was made of rough hewn logs about 16 feet high and stakes driven into the ground. Anyone crossing or even touching this deadline was shot without warning by the sentries in the guard platforms called the pigeon roosts. On the stockade, it is considered possible, although not established, that the modern term deadline, in the sense of a time limit, derives from this. Andersonville prisoners and tents, southwest view, show the deadline August 17, 1864. At this stage of the war, Andersonville Prison was frequently undersupplied with food, and by 1864, civilians in the Confederacy and soldiers of the Confederate Army were also struggling to obtain sufficient quantities of food. The storage of fare was suffered by prisoners and Confederate personnel alike within the fort, but the prisoners received less than the guards. Unlike the captives, the guards did not become severely emaciated or suffered from scurvy as consequences of vitamin C deficiency due to a lack of fresh fruits and vegetables in their diet. The poor diets and results of scurvy were likely a major cause of camp high mortality rate, as well as dysentery and typhoid fever. These resulted from filthy living conditions and poor sanitation. The only source of drinking water was a creek that also served as a camp latrine. It was filled at times with fecal matter from thousands of sick and dying men. Even when sufficient quantities of supplies were available, they were of poor quality and inadequately prepared. There were no new outfits given to the prisoners, whose own clothing was often falling to pieces. In some cases, garments were taken from the dead. John McElroy, a prisoner of Andersonville, recalled, "Before one was fairly cold, his clothes would be appropriately divided, and I seen many sharp fights between contesting claimants." Although the prison was surrounded by forests, very little wood was allowed to the prisoners for warmth or cooking. This, along with the lack of utensils, made it almost impossible for the prisoners to cook the meager food rations that they received, which consisted of poorly milled corn flour. During the summer of 1864, Union prisoners suffered greatly from hunger, exposure, and disease. Within 7 months, about a third had died from dysentery and scurvy. They were buried in mass graves, the standard practice of Confederate prisoner authorities at Andersonville. In 1864, the Confederate Surgeon General asked Joseph Jones an expert on infectious disease, to investigate the high mortality rate at the camp. He concluded that it was due to dysentery, bloody diarrhea caused by vitamin C deficiency. In 2010, the historian Rosemary Drisdell said that the hookworm disease, a condition not recognized or known during the Civil War, was a major cause of many of the fatalities among the prisoners. At the time of the Civil War, concept of prisoners of war camp was still new. It was not until 1863 that President Lincoln demanded a code of conduct be instituted to guarantee prisoners of war an entitlement to food and medical treatment and protect them from enslavement, torture, and murder. Andersonville did not provide its occupants with these guarantees. The prisoners of Andersonville, without any sort of law enforcement or protection, functioned more closely to a primitive society than a civil one. As such, survival often depended on the strength of the prisoner's social network within the prison. A prisoner with friends inside Andersonville was more likely to survive than a lone prisoner. Social networks provided prisoners with food, clothes, shelter, moral support, training opportunities, and protection against other prisoners. One study found that a prisoner having a strong social network within Andersonville had a statistically significant positive effect on survival probabilities, and that the closer ties between friends, as measured by such identifiers as a kinship in the same hometown, the bigger the effect. During the war, 45,000 prisoners were received at Andersonville Prison. Of these, nearly 13,000 died. The nature and cause of the deaths were sources of controversy among the historians. Some contend that the deaths resulted from Confederate policy and were war crimes against the Union prisoners, while others stated that they resulted from disease promoted, severe overcrowding, and widespread food shortage in the Confederate states, prison officials' incompetence, and the breakdown of the prisoner exchange system, caused by the Confederacy refusal to include black Union troops in the exchanges. The stockade became severely overcrowded. During the war, disease was primary cause of death in both armies. Infectious disease was a chronic problem due to poor sanitation in regular as well as prison. Andersonville Prison was liberated by the Union Army in May of 1865, with the prisoners inside being found and described as human skeletons amid hellish scenes of desolation. After the war, Henry Wirtz, commander of the inner stockade at Camp Sumter, was tried by military tribunal of charges of war crimes. The trial was presided over Union General Lew Wallace and featured Chief Judge Advocate General Prosecutor Norton Parker Chipman. Wirtz presented evidence that he had pleaded to the Confederate authorities to try to get more food and water for the prisoners, and he tried to improve the conditions of the prisoners inside.
The military commission of 9 prominent Union officers convened the Wirtz Tribunal in the U.S. Capitol building in August 21, 1865. They found the commandant of the prison, Captain Hartman Henrik Wirtz, guilty of war crimes for mistreatment of Union prisoners and was sentenced to death. He was hung in Washington, D.C. per the orders of President Andrew Johnson. He was later found to be a scapegoat for the Confederate government mishandling of prisoners. He was wrongly found guilty. Of the 13 men he was accused of murdering, not one could be identified. He claimed until his death that he was innocent and just following orders. Wirtz's remains were buried in Mount Olivet Cemetery in Washington, D.C., where they still reside under a tombstone that reads, Confederate Hero and Martyr.
Wirtz was one of the 3 men executed after the war for the war crimes, and the only Confederate official. The revelation of the prisoners' suffering was one of the factors that affected the public opinion in the North regarding the South after the close of the Civil War. Wirtz was not the only person prosecuted for his actions in Andersonville. James Duncan, who had worked in the quartermaster's office at Camp Sumter, convicted of manslaughter for allegedly withholding food from some of the prisoners. Duncan had previously been called as a defense witness for Wirtz, but was arrested when he arrived to give evidence. The National Prisoner of War Museum opened in 1998 as a memorial to all American prisoners of war. Exhibits use arts, photographs, and displays, and video presentations to depict and capture the living conditions and hardships and the experiences of the American prisoners of war in all periods. The museum also serves as a park's visitor center. Andersonville Cemetery is the final resting place for many Union prisoners who died while being held at Camp Sumter and at Andersonville as POWs. The prisoners' burial ground at Camp Sumter has been made into a national cemetery. It contains 13,714 graves, of which 921 are marked unknown. As a national cemetery, it is also used as a burial place for more recent veterans and their dependents. Visitors can walk the 26.5 acres of Camp Sumter, which has been outlined with double rows of white posts. Two sections of the stockade wall have been reconstructed, the north gate and the northeast corner.
I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and hit that notification icon for the latest videos as they are released. Thanks for watching and catch you in the next one. Ciao for now.